The night air was crisp, carrying the faint sound of sirens weaving through the city's quiet streets. In the heart of downtown, beneath the harsh glow of streetlights, a woman's lifeless body lay sprawled on the pavement. Blood pooled around her, a horrific testament to the savage violence that had been inflicted just hours earlier. This wasn't the first time the city had been awakened by such brutality, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As police arrived at the scene, the usual protocols kicked in. Crime scene tape went up, officers took positions, and the first of many investigators began documenting the evidence. But what set this case apart from the others was the taunting phone call made just an hour after the discovery. The killer, a man known only as the Shadow, had called the police station, his voice low and mocking. "You'll never catch me," he jeered, his words dripping with arrogance. "I've been to places you'll never dare look, and I'm already moving on to the next." For over a decade, he would continue to haunt police departments across multiple states, mocking authorities with calls, letters, and even an eerie confession about his craft. He evaded every attempt to capture him. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no pattern. His unpredictability was his greatest weapon, and yet he relished in the attention. To the world, he was a ghost, and the authorities' inability to catch him only fueled his laughter. For years, the police could only watch as the body count rose, his pattern unmistakable in its violence, but yet too scattered in geography to connect the dots. It was a true cat-and-mouse game. No evidence, no trail, but deep down, every investigator knew that this killer was leaving behind something. They just didn't know where to look. And then, in the quiet of a forensic lab in an unassuming town in California, a breakthrough would come that would send shockwaves through the investigation. It wasn't a new technique, nor was it some groundbreaking discovery. It was DNA. DNA had been collected from several crime scenes, but it had always yielded nothing definitive. What they didn't know then was that the technology was finally catching up to the criminal. The new DNA databases, linked across states, were beginning to reveal something the police hadn't expected. A connection that would tie this serial killer to multiple unsolved murders across the country. As investigators pieced together the evidence, they realized that the killer's bravado was his undoing. His confidence, once unshakable, was about to meet its reckoning. And soon, his mocking voice would fade into the echoes of a past he thought he could escape forever. Inside a dimly lit forensic lab, an unassuming technician carefully examined a set of DNA samples recovered from a crime scene in Nevada. The case had been cold for nearly 5 years, the murderer slipping through every possible crack in the investigation. But as the technician worked, something extraordinary was unfolding in the background. The killer's DNA, collected from the bloodied clothes of his victims, was finally being processed in the new state-of-the-art database. For years, the investigative teams had feared that they would never catch the Shadow. He had slipped between the cracks of the traditional investigative methods, the cross-state murders, the untraceable phone calls, and the cryptic letters. There had been no patterns, no solid leads, just a string of bodies and unanswered questions. But now, as the technician hit enter on the keyboard, the system hummed to life. A match. The results flashed across the screen like a beacon of hope. A partial DNA match to a man named Jacob Hollis, a man with no criminal record, but a long history of unsolved mysteries following in his wake. The system flagged the match with a cold precision, and in that moment, the case went from being a lost cause to a glimmer of hope. The elusive killer, so careful in his execution, had left behind the one piece of evidence that would seal his fate: his genetic fingerprint. The team wasted no time. Investigators combed through Hollis's life, tracing his movements, his contacts, and his travels. What they found was chilling. For years, Hollis had lived under the radar, his name never once flagged for suspicion. Yet, as they pulled more pieces together, a terrifying picture began to emerge. Hollis had been moving across states, leaving behind a trail of terror. The more they dug, the clearer the picture became. Hollis's DNA had been present at multiple crime scenes across the U.S., from the cold streets of Pittsburgh to the dark alleyways of Denver. Each murder followed the same brutal pattern. Victims, often women, were attacked, killed, and left without a trace of the murderer, except for the DNA, which was now slowly but surely connecting him to each of his crimes. It wasn't just the DNA that revealed his connections, it was the pattern of his methodical movements. Investigators discovered that Hollis had been moving in a calculated way, staying just ahead of the law while leaving enough evidence behind to eventually bring him down. The killer's mocking calls to the police had been a challenge, but this match was a game changer. Now, the hunt for the shadow was no longer theoretical. It was real, tangible, and closing in fast. But Jacob Hollis, the man behind the facade, wasn't about to make it easy. His confidence, once unshakable, would soon be replaced with fear. The streets of Salt Lake City were eerily calm as evenings settled over the city. A warm breeze stirred the dust along the sidewalks, but inside the local police headquarters, a storm was brewing. Investigators, fueled by the breakthrough in DNA, were now piecing together the puzzle they had been chasing for over a decade. The Shadow, as he had become known, was no longer an anonymous figure hiding in the shadows. He was a man, and they had his name: Jacob Hollis. For the first time in years, the authorities felt a sense of urgency that they hadn't experienced in a long while. Hollis's movements were being traced, and his past was being unearthed. He had been a quiet, seemingly unremarkable man, never suspected of anything sinister, but now everything about him was under intense scrutiny. His phone records, travel logs, and even old acquaintances were all being examined, and the picture that emerged was unsettling. Jacob Hollis had lived a life full of small, seemingly insignificant choices that, when examined under the weight of the investigation, painted him as a predator who had expertly maneuvered through life just one step ahead of the law. But now his quiet existence was unraveling. He had traveled across the country for years, always staying just out of reach, always one move ahead. And now he was cornered. But the authorities weren't the only ones closing in. As investigators prepared to make their move, Hollis began to sense the pressure. He had always been one step ahead, but the reality was setting in that his reign of terror was nearing its end. He had been taunting police for over a decade, his ego growing with every unsolved case, every mocking phone call. Now the pieces were falling into place. His movements were becoming increasingly erratic, and his once cool demeanor was starting to slip. Hollis began to panic. The once impregnable fortress he had built around himself was now crumbling. He could hear the sirens closing in, the footsteps of the law echoing louder with each passing day. His confidence turned to paranoia. The taunting calls to police officers ceased, replaced by frantic silences and frantic, disjointed thoughts. It was clear that the killer, who once laughed in the face of law enforcement, was now overwhelmed by fear that he might finally be caught. The investigation continued to unfold, but Jacob Hollis, aware of the tightening noose, began to make reckless decisions. Moving from one city to the next, he attempted to flee the inevitable, but there was no escaping the long arm of the law. The DNA evidence, once dismissed by the killer as insignificant, had become the very thing that would ensure his capture. The afternoon sun beat down on the city of Denver, casting long shadows across the downtown streets. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of trees, but within the walls of the Denver Police Department, the air was thick with tension. The walls that had once seemed insurmountable to the investigation were now rapidly closing in around Jacob Hollis.
After years of evading the authorities, his world was beginning to shrink with every passing minute. With the DNA evidence connecting him to multiple murders, the search for Hollis had shifted from a nationwide manhunt to a more localized, targeted effort. The authorities knew his pattern, his movements, his preferences, and now they were tracking his every step. Officers in various cities were on high alert, scouring his last known whereabouts for any sign of him. Hollis, for all his careful planning, had underestimated one key factor: the power of modern technology. The DNA match had opened doors to surveillance footage, cell phone data, and a network of digital footprints that tied him directly to several of the crime scenes. His once carefully crafted anonymity was now disintegrating, piece by piece, in front of the investigators' eyes. Police officers reviewed video footage from gas stations, motels, and convenience stores, tracking his movements from one location to the next. But Hollis wasn't completely blind to the mounting pressure. As the police closed in on Denver, he began to make his final, desperate attempts to cover his tracks. His phone had been traced to a small motel on the outskirts of the city, but by the time officers arrived, he had already checked out. No trace. His old habits, the ones that had allowed him to remain elusive for so long, were now his undoing. He was slipping, making mistakes he had never made before. But even as his plans unraveled, Hollis wasn't entirely unprepared. He had learned to live under the radar, and for a moment, he seemed to slip through the cracks once more. A surveillance video showed him entering a small, nondescript apartment building, his most recent hiding place. But this time, the police were ready. The net had tightened. The moment had arrived. A task force, armed with warrants and all the resources they needed, descended on the building. The time for running had passed. This wasn't just a manhunt anymore, it was a final showdown. As officers approached the apartment, the once confident killer, who had laughed in the face of law enforcement, was now a cornered animal.
3, 2, 1.
The silence in the air was suffocating. Outside the apartment complex, officers lined the perimeter, each one bracing for the inevitable. The lights of the police cars flashed in the distance, casting long, menacing shadows across the narrow alleyways. Inside, Jacob Hollis was still. He sat in the dim glow of his apartment, his face etched with a mix of fear and defiance. He had evaded capture for over a decade, his every move calculated to stay just one step ahead. But now, trapped in a room with nowhere to run, his mind raced. Hollis had been watching the news. He knew the authorities were closing in. The reports about his DNA, their surveillance footage, the tips from locals, it all pointed to him. He had never felt so vulnerable. The mocking, taunting phone calls he once made to the police seemed like distant memories now, as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, gripped by the reality of his situation. He had no plan left. His escape routes were all compromised, and the walls of his prison were closing in. He knew that the police were outside. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat motionless, trying to steady his breath. His pride had been his greatest asset, but now it seemed like a cruel joke. His years of arrogance were nothing compared to the fear that clutched at his throat in these final moments. The police had coordinated every move. They knew that Hollis was likely to be armed, and they prepared for the worst. With precise movements, a SWAT team slowly approached the door. Every step was calculated, and every officer remained vigilant, knowing that this could end in a confrontation. Inside the apartment, the door creaked as it began to open. Hollis had no choice but to face it. He stood up, moving toward the door, the weight of his years of evasion now bearing down on him. He had been the hunter for so long. Now he was the hunted. As the officers burst through the door, Hollis reacted swiftly, but not quickly enough. The flashing lights and the sound of heavy boots pounding against the floor filled the apartment. In a matter of seconds, the officers had him subdued, his defiant smirk replaced by a hollow stare.
The finality of the moment seemed to sink in as they cuffed his hands behind his back. The once untouchable serial killer, who had taunted authorities and eluded capture for over 10 years, was now in the hands of those he had mocked for so long. His DNA, that once seemed like a trivial detail, now stood as the key to his downfall. His reign of terror had finally ended. As he was escorted out of the apartment, his head hung low, the police lights flashing on his face, no longer a ghost in the night, but a man who had underestimated the power of modern science and a relentless investigation. The case that had haunted multiple states for over a decade was now closed. The killer who once laughed at the police was now silent, his final laugh swallowed by the reality of his capture.